Welcome, dear friends, to a journey through time, to the very heart of what would one day become one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known, Rome, Esquiline. But before the glory, before the empire, there was a land of hills, rivers, and legends. Today, we step back to an era when the Tiber River flowed through untamed valleys, when shepherds, traders, and warriors shared the land with gods and myths. Our story begins on 7 hills: Palatine, Aventine, Capitoline, Quirinal, Viminal, Esquiline, and Caelian, each with its own tale, its own heroes, and its own secrets. Together we'll uncover the myths that shaped the city's soul, the struggles that tested its people, and the moments that planted the seeds of Rome's destiny. This is more than history. It is the birth of a legend. So sit back, open your mind to the whispers of the past, and let's set forth on a path that begins in shadow and ends in the eternal light of the eternal city. Welcome to early Rome, the 7 hills, long before marble temples gleamed under the Italian sun, before legions marched under Rome's proud banners. There was a valley, quiet, fertile, and wild. This was the Tiber Valley, where gentle hills embraced a winding river and forests whispered in the wind. The land was a patchwork of oak groves, meadows, and rocky outcrops, where deer grazed freely and wolves prowled the shadows. The Tiber River was the lifeblood of this land. Its waters flowed from the distant Apennines, carrying stories of the mountains, and spilled into the great Tyrrhenian Sea. It was both a giver of life and a force of destruction, swelling in the spring with snowmelt and flooding the valley's edges. To those who lived here, it was sacred, a god in its own right. Small communities of Lataiking tribes dotted the landscape. They were shepherds and farmers, hunters and gatherers, bound to the rhythms of nature. Their huts of mud and reed stood on the slopes, safe from the river's floods. At night, they would gather around fires, telling tales of spirits in the hills and gods who guarded the river. This was a place where the divine touched the earth. Every grove, every spring, every hilltop was thought to belong to a deity. Offerings of grain and milk were left at stone altars. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs. The people lived not in opposition to nature, but as part of it, wary of its dangers, grateful for its gifts. Among the hills, 2 stood out, the Palatine and the Aventine. The Palatine, with its high and central position, offered a commanding view of the valley. The Aventine, a little wilder, drew those who lived apart from the main tribes. These hills, still unnamed in this early age, would one day cradle the beginnings of Rome. Yet, in this time there was no thought of empire. There was only survival and the unbroken chain of the seasons. The people marked time not with years, but with harvests, floods, and the turning of the constellations. Overhead, they lived with the certainty that the gods walked among them. In the rustle of leaves, in the call of an eagle, in the shifting currents of the Tiber. This was the cradle before the cradle, the land before the city. Here, in the quiet hum of life along the river, the seeds of greatness lay hidden, waiting for the moment when myth and history would entwine. In the Tiber Valley, the story of Rome was already stirring, not in the roar of armies, but in the whisper of the wind over 7 hills tranked. In the days before Rome had a name, the hills that would one day shape its destiny were not merely mounds of earth. They were living shrines to unseen powers. The people who dwelt here believed that every rise and hollow had its guardian, a spirit older than humankind, watching and guiding those who dared to settle near. The Palatine was the dwelling place of a sun god, its slopes kissed by dawn's first light. The Aventine belonged to a goddess of the hunt, fierce and solitary, whose favor was sought by hunters before they ventured into the deep forests. The Capitoline, crowned with rocky outcrops, was home to a stormbringer, his voice heard in the rumble of distant thunder. Life here was shaped by ritual. On certain nights, tribes gathered on the summits, lighting great fires so the gods might see their devotion. Offerings of grain, wine, and small animals were left upon flat stones. The smoke curled into the night, carrying prayers upward. To anger a hill-s god was to invite famine, disease, or flood. To please them was to win a bountiful harvest and safe passage through the wild. Among the tribes, the most revered figures were the custards Caelian, keepers of the hills. They were storytellers, healers, and priests who claimed to hear the whispers of the gods in the dart, wind, and read their will in the flight of birds. They taught the people how to respect the sacred boundaries, where to plant, when to reap, and when to leave the hills untouched. To outsiders, these rites might have seemed simple, but to the people of the Tiber Valley, they were the very threads that wove life together. Before any great decision, whether to move a camp, begin a hunt, or cross into another tribe's lands, the will of the hill gods was sought. Over time, each hill became known for its blessings and its warnings. The Palatine promised safety and fertile land. The Aventine favored those who lived apart from the main tribes. The Capitoline guarded secrets of the skies. Quirinal and Viminal were the haunts of watchful spirits, protecting the boundaries between clans. Esquiline's broad slopes gave shelter to the weary traveler, while Caelian's dense woods hid the warriors who defended the valley. This world was not divided between myth and reality. They were one and the same. The gods of the hills were as real to these people as aught, the stones beneath their feet and the river flowing at their side. And though centuries would pass and the language of worship would change, the hills would never lose their sacred weight. In the years to come, they would be crowned with temples and towers. But beneath the marble and mortar, the ancient spirits would remain, patient and eternal. Of all the 7 hills, the Palatine stands like a quiet heart, central, commanding, and old beyond memory. Here the dawn arrives first, combing the ridge with light, revealing terraces where wild thyme clings to rock and larks rise in startled spirals. The Palatine is both lookout and refuge, a natural fortress ringed by slopes that fall toward the Tiber's bend. In this high ground, a people seeking safety could see the world coming before it arrived. Long before monuments, the Palatine bore only footprints, shepherds circling their flocks, women carrying baskets of grain, children chasing each other where dry grass whispered, huts of wattle and daub clustered against the wind, low and warm, their roofs thatched with straw. At night, fires glowed like embers fallen from the sky. The earth here felt steady, less marshy than the lowlands, less tangled than the deep woods. And so the Palatine invited settlement, asked quietly to be chosen. The hill kept its own calendar. Spring brought the first shoots in the hillside gardens. Summer drove the people to draw water. At dawn and dusk, autumn's wind threshed the chaff from barley, laid on woven mats. Winter pressed them into circles around the hearth. Through it all, the Palatine listened. In every gust, the settlers heard counsel. In every bird's flight, they read a path. Near a shaded cleft in the rock, a cave that travelers whispered was sacred, elders taught the young to honor boundaries, where to graze, and where to leave the ground untouched, where offerings should be poured, and where silence itself was an offering. Stories condensed around that cave like dew, speaking of twins and wolves, of dangers survived and destinies intertwined. Whether history or omen, the Palatine held these tales with the patience of stone. Practical labors stitched the hill's days. Posts were sunk to anchor new huts, ditches were cut to guide the rain, and a palisade rose, log by log, to discourage prowling beasts and less friendly neighbors. Traders, curious and hungry for news, climbed the path bearing coarse salt, bright beads, and rough cloth. They left with smoked cheese, cured skins, and promises to return. With each exchange, the Palatine's circles widened, yet the hill's power was never only in timber and earth. At dusk, when the wind fell and the Tiber turned to bronze, a hush gathered on the ridge. The settlers faced west and thanked the unseen for another day unbroken. They did not claim the hill so much as enter into covenant with it, a pact of vigilance and care. From this steep sanctuary, a notion took root that scattered hearths could be braided into a single fire, that a handful of huts could imagine a future larger than their shadows. The Palatine, with its broad shoulders and clear horizons, gave that idea a home. What begins as shelter may become a city. What begins as watchfulness may become destiny. And on the Palatine, destiny had found its height. If the Palatine was a cradle of community, the Aventine was the refuge of those who stood apart. Its slopes were steeper, its paths tangled with thickets, its air heavy with the resin of pines and the rustle of boar in the undergrowth. To many, the Aventine seemed a place on the edge of the known world. Yet for some, that edge was exactly where they belonged. Those who climbed the Aventine came for different reasons. Some fled disputes with neighboring tribes. Others sought freedom from the authority of elders. A few were wanderers with no kin to claim them. Here, among the high pines and narrow clearings, they built their lives beyond the watch of the Palatine. They fashioned shelters from rough-hewn timber, lashed with leather and lined with fur. The smoke from their hearths curled into the canopy rather than the open sky, hiding their presence. In the quiet spaces between the trees, the Aventine people honored a huntress goddess, swift-footed, silver-eyed, who favored the solitary and the strong. Altars of stone were hidden in groves, where offerings of venison, wild honey, and carved antler were left in her honor. Hunters rose before dawn, slipping through the mist to track deer and wild boar, reading their signs in broken ferns and the soft churn of earth. The Aventine community was bound less by law than by a shared understanding. Here one earned one's place through skill and endurance. No leader ruled the hill outright. Rather, respect was given to those who could provide. The surest hunter, the keenest scout, the healer who knew which roots could draw fever from the body. Relations with the tribes of the Palatine and other hills were rare, but not hostile. At times, trade took place at the base of the hill. Furs for grain, smoked meat for pottery. Yet the Aventine dwellers kept their distance, wary of entanglements. To them, freedom was not a prize to be shared, but a fire that could be easily quenched by too many hands. But the hill itself was a demanding master. Winters bit harder here. Storms swept down from the west with little warning, tearing at huts and soaking stores of grain. Wild beasts were bolder, and the paths treacherous after rain. Only those who adapted could survive. Over years, the Aventine gathered a reputation, not as a place of exile, but as a hill of choice. It was the ascent of those unwilling to be bound, the rise of those who valued the whispering pines over the crowded hearth. And though the Aventine would one day be drawn into the fold of Rome, its spirit would remain untamed, a reminder that even in a city's heart, there must be room for the wild. Rising like a sentinel above the Tiber's bend, the Capitoline Hill was a fortress shaped by nature itself. Its slopes were steep, its crown a rugged spine of stone that seemed to challenge the sky. To those who gazed up from the lowlands, the Capitoline appeared as the dwelling place of gods, a citadel not built by human hands, but by the will of the earth. Here storms often gathered first, their dark bellies rolling in from the west to break against the stone. Lightning split the air, and thunder cracked so loud it shook the ground beneath the huts. The people of the Capitoline saw this not as danger, but as a sign of favor from the storm-bringer god they revered, a mighty spirit whose power was said to guard their hill from harm. The Capitoline settlement clung to the safer terraces, huts set against the rock like swallows' nests. A narrow path spiraled up from the valley floor, its edges lined with small cairns where travelers left offerings. A handful of grain, a carved token, a strip of cloth, to ask the hill's blessing before climbing higher. At the summit stood the great stone, a towering outcrop polished by centuries of wind and rain. Here the storm seers kept vigil, reading the signs in the clouds and the flight of birds. In the spring, they called for rains to swell the Tiber and feed the crops. Spisor. In the harvest months, they prayed for calm skies so grain could be gathered without spoil. Life on the Capitoline was hard, but its people were proud. The steep slopes were natural walls, making the hill nearly unassailable. In troubled times, families from the surrounding lowlands would flee here, bringing what they could carry, seeking refuge behind its stone barricades. From the summit, one could see the entire valley, the Palatine and Aventine hills rising to the south, the river Silver curve, and beyond it, the dark smudge of far-off forests. The Capitoline folk were skilled in stonework, shaping tools and weapons from the rock that underpinned their lives. They built small terraces for growing hardy crops and collected rainwater in stone cisterns carved deep into the hill. In return for these labors, they believed the Stormbringer god kept their enemies at bay. In quiet moments, when the storms had passed and the air was clear, the summit felt close enough to touch the heavens. The people would gather, facing the horizon, and give thanks for the shelter and strength their hill provided. The Capitoline was more than a home. It was a guardian, a watchtower, and a reminder that even in the wild lands before Rome, there were places too sacred to fall. North of the Capitoline, beyond a shallow saddle in the land, rose the Quirinal Hill. Long, broad, and shaped like the prow of a ship cutting through the valley winds. Its name among the early tribes was whispered with respect, for here dwelled warriors whose spears flashed like the sun on the river's surface. The Quirinal was not as steep as the Capitoline, but its height still commanded sweeping views of the Tiber plain. The tribes who settled here prized vigilance above all. They were watchmen and border guards, stationed where the open lands stretched toward unknown horizons. Theirs was the first sight of traders, wanderers, and, when fate was less kind, raiders who tested the valley as peace. The people of the Quirinal trained from youth in the use of the spear. Boys and girls alike learned to balance its weight, to strike with precision, and to throw so the weapon's shaft hummed through the air before finding its mark. Spears here were not only weapons, they were badges of adulthood, passed from parent to child, carved with the family S-marks. On the hilltop, a large open field served as the training ground. Here, warriors sparred with shields of rawhide and wooden spears tipped with fire-hardened points. Elders judged contests, rewarding skill, courage, and cunning. Beyond these drills, the Quirinal's fighters learned to read tracks, to move silently through tall grass, and to communicate with subtle hand signals over distance. The Quirinal was also home to the Hall of Spears, a long, timber hall where the Hillis warriors gathered at night to eat, sick fetch plan and pass on their tales. The hall's rafters were hung with the weapons of ancestors, each a reminder of past victories and sacrifices. In the glow of the hearth fire, young ones listened to these stories, dreaming of the day they would join the line of defenders. Though the hill's life revolved around defense, the Quirinal folk were not isolated. They welcomed trade in leather goods, hunting dogs, and finely balanced spearheads of bronze. Their alliances with the Capitoline and Palatine ensured that the Valley Escor remained strong. When storms swept across the land, the Quirinal watchfires still burned on the ridge, a steady signal to the rest of the hills. To the people below, those flames meant safety, vigilance, and the promise that the Hill of Spears would always stand ready. In the centuries to come, the Quirinal would be crowned with temples and stately homes. But in this early age, it was a place of discipline and readiness where every spear cast was a pledge, not only to defend the land, but to keep the spirit of the warrior alive. Nestled like a slender ridge between the Quirinal and the Esquiline, the Viminal hill was the smallest of the seven, yet it held a role unlike any other. It was the Hill of Crossings, a place where different peoples, trades, and customs met. Its name in the old tongue came from the Viminal, with the willows that grew thick along the streams at its base, their supple branches used for weaving baskets, fish traps, and fences. The Viminal slopes were less steep than the others, making it a natural thoroughfare. Traders from the north passed here on their way to the Palatine. Hunters from the east brought pelts to exchange. Wandering storytellers paused to share news for a meal. Life on the Viminal was a constant flow of arrivals and departures. Because of its position, the people here learned to speak more than one dialect, to weigh goods from far-off places, and to adapt to the customs of visitors. Markets gathered in open clearings where woven mats displayed goods, baskets of smoked fish, clay jars of honey, salt from distant coasts, and bright beads traded for furs. The air was filled with the mingled scent of roasting meat, wet willow bark, and the resin of pine torches. The Viminal folk were known for their craft in weaving. Their willow work was prized for its strength and fine patterning, from humble baskets to intricate cradles and storage chests. Children learned the skill early, hands nimble before they could wield a spear. The hills weavers worked in longhouses where strands of willow hung drying in fragrant bundles. Though not warriors by tradition, the Viminal people were no strangers to defense. The narrow paths to the hilltop could be blocked quickly with woven barricades. Slings and hunting spears hung ready by each doorway. Yet their strength lay in connection rather than conflict, in knowing the ways of the hills and keeping the threads of trade strong. At twilight, when the markets closed, the hill took on a quieter rhythm. Visitors shared stories by the fire, speaking of storms at sea, battles in far valleys, or festivals in lands beyond the Tiber bend. The Viminal became a tapestry of voices, a reminder that even in these early days, the hills were not isolated worlds, but part of a larger weave. In centuries to come, this hill would see walls, gates, and bustling streets. But here, in its earliest age, the Viminal was a bridge between peoples, a place where the first threads of Rome's cosmopolitan heart were spun from willow and shared firelight. To the east, where the land rises gently before giving way to distant forests, stands the Esquiline Hill, the broadest of the seven. It slopes a patchwork of open meadows and shaded groves. From here, the view stretched far beyond the Tiber Valley, toward the rugged hills and dark pine woods that marked the edge of the known world. The Esquiline was a place of openness, a frontier hill that faced outward rather than inward. For this reason, it became home to those who lived closest to the wild: hunters, woodcutters, gatherers of herbs and roots, and the scouts who ventured into the forests to watch for signs of friend or foe. It was here that the first traces of foreign traders were spotted. Strangers with cloaks dyed in unfamiliar colors, leading pack animals burdened with bronze and amber. The Hill-S people were skilled in woodcraft. They built sturdy longhouses from oak beams, storing meat in elevated smokehouses to keep it safe from wolves. Children were taught to set snares for small game and to recognize the tracks of boar, deer, and bear. In the groves, healers searched for rare plants used to treat wounds, fevers, and snake bites. Tent. The Esquiline was also a place of gathering before long journeys. Scouts from the other hills came here to prepare for expeditions. Beyond the valley, knowing the Hill-S foragers could supply smoked meat, dried berries, and finely worked wooden tools. These expeditions sometimes returned with precious materials: obsidian from far mountains, shells from the coast, but also with news of lands and peoples beyond the horizon. At dusk, the meadows glowed gold as herders brought their flocks in from grazing. The air filled with the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat, and voices rose in songs that told of hunts, storms, and the endless push of the frontier. Yet the Esquiline was not without danger. To live here meant facing the threat of sudden raids from beyond the forests, harsh winters that froze the streams, and wild animals bold enough to wander close to the hearth. But its people were resilient, bound together by the knowledge that their hill was the first to meet whatever the outside world might send. In later centuries, this hill would be drawn into the dense heart of the growing city, its meadows built over with homes and markets. But in these early days, the Esquiline stood like an open door to the world, wide, watchful, and unafraid. South of the Palatine, where the land swells into a broad, wooded rise, stands the Caelian Hill, a place known for its warriors. In the earliest days, its slopes were covered in dense oak and chestnut, the air filled with the drumming of woodpeckers and the distant crack of branches under the feet of deer. Yet within those trees, the people of the Caelian trained in the arts of defense, turning the hill into both a home and a stronghold. The Caelian settlers were drawn from many tribes, some arriving by alliance, others by marriage, and a few by exile from disputes on other hills. This blend gave the community a diversity of skills: the hunting precision of the Aventine, the stonework of the Capitoline, the trade connections of the Viminal. Here, these talents were forged into a single purpose: to keep the valley safe. The warriors of the Caelian trained daily. In the forest glades, they learned to move silently among trees, to fight in close quarters where branches limited the swing of a weapon, and to use the Hill-S natural terrain to their advantage. Spears, axes, and short blades were their tools, often paired with shields painted in ochre and charcoal patterns, meant to intimidate. At the Hill-S crest, a fortified clearing served as the warriors' gathering place. Here stood the Hall of Blades, its walls hung with weapons both old and new. Every victory, whether against raiders, wild beasts, or rival bands, was marked by a ceremony in this hall. Fallen warriors were honored with carvings on the beams, each mark a story of bravery to be told by the fire. The Caelian also produced skilled armorers. Their work ranged from hardened leather breastplates to bronze fittings scavenged through trade or crafted by allied smiths. Young warriors often forged their own first weapon under the guidance of an elder, believing it bound their spirit to the hill's protection. Life here was not all battle and drill. Families tended small gardens between the oaks, and children learned to hunt rabbits and game birds before they could lift a full-sized spear. Yet every household was prepared. At the first sound of the warning horn, all could arm themselves and retreat to the fortified clearing. In time, the Caelians' reputation would spread, and the hill would be seen as the arm and shield of the growing city. But in this early age, it was a brotherhood and sisterhood of defense, a community bound by oath and blade, watching the southern approaches to the valley with eyes that never tired. Before Rome was city or empire, before marble and markets, the hills were bound together by a humbler thread: the shepherds. From the rocky Palatine heights to the meadows of the Esquiline, their flocks moved like drifting clouds over grass and stone, linking the lives of all who called the Seven Hills home. Shepherding was the oldest rhythm of the valley. Each dawn, men and women rose before the sun, gathering their staffs and slings before leading sheep and goats down narrow trails. Souls, the animals knew the paths as well as their keepers, the shady glens where the grass was sweetest, the shallow river fords, and the ridges where the wind kept flies at bay. Though every hill had its own customs, the shepherds often met where pastures overlapped. These were moments for exchanging news, sharing food, and arranging trades: a fine ram for a cured hide, a basket of cheese for a pot of honey. In these gatherings, the valley's human tapestry was quietly woven. Life among the flocks demanded skill. A shepherd needed to read the sky for signs of storms, to follow tracks when an animal strayed, and to guard against wolves that slipped like shadows through the undergrowth. Their slings were never far from hand, and their voices carried far in the open air, calling, singing, or whistling patterns the sheep knew by heart. At night, the flocks were brought into pens made of woven willow or rough stone, the shepherds sleeping nearby with dogs curled at their feet. The scent of wood smoke, wool, and warm milk filled the darkness. Around low fires, stories were told of hills that had spirits, of gods that walked in the form of rams or goats, of great storms survived, and seasons when grass grew as high as a man's waist. Shepherding also shaped the valley's earliest economy. Wool was spun into thread. Milk was turned into hard cheese that could last through winter. Surplus lambs were traded to visiting merchants. Over time, these exchanges knit the hills together more tightly than any treaty. In the centuries to come, Rome's shepherd past would fade beneath its stone streets. Yet echoes would remain. In the pastoral festivals of the city, in the imagery of rams and sheep carved on temple friezes, and in the old songs still hummed by herdsmen far from the city gates. But in this early age, shepherds were the quiet lifeblood of the hills, the watchers and wanderers who kept the land's pulse steady. Without them, there would have been no flocks to feed the people, no trade to connect the hills, and no stories to keep the valley's spirit alive. Before coin and market square, before ships and paved roads, the life of the Seven Hills was held together by barter and the bonds of tribe. Trade here was not an occasional affair, but a constant hum, a rhythm that carried goods, stories, and alliances from one slope to the next. Each hill had its strengths. The Palatine's central position made it a natural gathering place. The Aventine provided fine furs and wild game. The Capitoline shaped tools and weapons from stone. The Quirinal offered skilled guards and warriors. The Viminal wove baskets and crafted storage goods. The Esquiline supplied timber and herbs from the edge of the forests. The Caelian forged weapons and trained fighters. Together, they formed a living network of exchange. Trading days were events in themselves. Tribespeople would descend the hills, carrying their goods in baskets, on poles, or strapped to the backs of donkeys. In the open spaces near the river or between hill slopes, they laid out mats and blankets, arranging wares in neat rows: hides, woven goods, smoked meat, pottery, flint tools, bundles of herbs, and jars of honey. There was no currency. Value was measured in usefulness and scarcity. A fine spearhead might be worth a month's supply of grain. A basket of goat cheese could be traded for a winter cloak. The exchange was often sealed not with contracts, but with shared food and drink, a sign that trust bound the deal as much as the goods themselves. Trade was also an opportunity for cultural exchange. Storytellers would stand near the crowds, weaving tales of hunts, storms, and ancestors. Healers from one hill would share remedies with those from another. Songs and dances spilled into the open space once trading slowed, turning commerce into celebration. Yet, trade was not without its tensions. Disputes over value or quality could spark arguments, and rivalries between hills sometimes flared into challenges or contests. But more often than not, the need for cooperation outweighed the lure of conflict. Everyone understood that the survival of one hill was tied to the strength of the others. Beyond goods, trade days were also for alliances. Marriages were arranged, oaths of friendship sworn, and plans for joint hunts or defensive patrols made over shared cups of fermented drink. The bonds formed in these moments would one day underpin the political alliances that shaped Rome's earliest governance. In centuries to come, Rome's marketplaces would be vast and crowded, its traders dealing in goods from across the known world. But here, in the days of the Seven Hills, trade was still intimate. A circle of people who knew each other's faces, voices, and stories, carrying more than just goods from one hill to the next. In the early days of the Seven Hills, the people of the Tiber Valley were not alone. So, to the north, beyond the rolling fields and wooded ridges, lived the Etruscans, a people of mystery, skill, and power. Their cities were older, their crafts more advanced, and their ways wrapped in a veil of ritual that seemed strange and alluring to the hill tribes. The first contact came through traders. Etruscan merchants arrived wearing dyed tunics and bronze jewelry, leading donkeys burdened with fine pottery, metal tools, and salt. They brought wines richer than any the valley had tasted, and intricate combs carved from bone. In return, they sought hides, wool, grain, and the skilled hands of local workers who could be drawn north for a season's labor. But the Etruscan gift was not only in goods, it was in ideas. They introduced new ways of building, walls made from cut stone instead of wattle and clay, roofs covered in baked tiles that shed the rain more cleanly. They brought knowledge of drainage and road building, making paths less muddy and more reliable. Their religious influence was equally deep. Etruscan priests carried with them polished bronze mirrors and tablets, inscribed with symbols unknown to the hill people. They spoke of reading the will of the gods in the flight of birds, in the pattern of lightning, and even in the entrails of sacrificed animals. Some among the Seven Hills saw these practices as powerful and worthy of adoption, others viewed them with suspicion, fearing that foreign gods might weaken their own. The Etruscans also brought music unlike any the valley had known. The deep thrum of double pipes, the clash of bronze cymbals, and songs that seemed to bend the air. During trade gatherings, these sounds would draw curious crowds, the young especially eager to learn the rhythms and dances. Over time, Etruscan artisans began to settle among the hills, marrying into local families and blending customs. Houses began to bear tiled roofs. Carved wooden beams showed motifs of strange beasts and divine figures. Tools became sharper, and warfare more organized as Etruscan-style helmets and armor found their way. into the Caelian as Hall of Blades and the Quirinal as Hall of Spears. This influence was not domination, not yet. It was an exchange, a weaving together of traditions, technologies, and beliefs. And though the hill folk retained their independence, the Etruscan touch began to shape what their community could imagine. In centuries ahead, the relationship between Rome and the Etruscans would grow more complex, with alliances, rivalries, and wars. But here, in this formative time, the Etruscan influence was a spark, one that lit new fires in the hearts and minds of the Seven Hills. Long before the historians set quill to parchment, the Seven Hills already carried stories, tales whispered by firesides, sung at festivals, and carved into the memory of each generation. These were the founding myths, the sacred narratives that gave meaning to the land and the people who dwelled upon it. The most enduring spoke of twin brothers, born of divine and mortal blood, abandoned on the banks of the Tiber, and saved by a she-wolf who nursed them in a cave on the Palatine. As they grew, the brothers, Romulus and Remus, learned the ways of hunters, herdsmen, and warriors. In time, they would seek to found a city, but a quarrel over its location and leadership ended in tragedy. Romulus, in a burst of rage, struck down Remus, becoming the first ruler of the city that would bear his name. The people told this story with reverence and caution. It spoke of destiny, but also of sacrifice, the notion that rightness is often bought at a terrible price. Do you? The cave where the wolf was said to have sheltered the twins became a sacred site. Offerings of milk and flowers left at its entrance each year. Yet the wolf tale was not the only origin. Some claim the Seven Hills were founded by ancient gods themselves, each hill gifted to a tribe in the dawn of time. Others told of a wandering hero from the east, Aeneas, who fled the burning city of Troy, carrying his father upon his back, guided by the will of the gods to a new home beside the Tiber. From his descendants, the line of Romulus was said to spring. These myths were more than entertainment. They were lessons. The she-wolf taught the value of protection and nurture. The quarrel of Romulus and Remus warned of the dangers of rivalry. The journey of Aeneas spoke of endurance and faith in divine purpose. Festivals kept these stories alive. On certain days in the spring, masked dancers reenacted the arrival of Aeneas. In autumn, boys dressed as wolf cubs ran races through the streets of the Palatine, howling with laughter and pride. Around the hearths, elders told the tales in voices that carried the weight of centuries, their listeners leaning in as if the characters might walk in at any moment. As the hills grew closer in alliance, these myths began to weave together into a shared heritage. Whether one believed in wolves, gods, or wandering heroes, all could agree the Seven Hills were more than earth and stone. They were the stage for a story that had begun long before and would echo long after. The people of this age were gone. The tale of Romulus and Remus was not just a fireside legend. It was the heartbeat of the Seven Hills, told as if the very stones had witnessed it. The story began on a storm-swept night along the swollen Tiber. A royal decree had doomed the newborn twins, the sons of Rhea Silvia, a Vestal priestess, and Mars, the god of war, cast into the river in a basket. They drifted until the current carried them to the foot of the Palatine, where the waters receded and left them stranded on a muddy bank. Here, fate intervened in the form of a she-wolf. Drawn by the cries of the infants, she carried them to her den in a sheltered cave, the Lupercal. There, she nursed them as if they were her own cubs, her warmth and milk giving them life. It was a scene that would be carved, painted, and reenacted for centuries. Two small boys beneath the watchful eyes of a wild protector. In time, a shepherd named Faustulus found the twins. He and his wife, Acca Laurentia, took them in, raising them as their own sons. The boys grew strong in the hills, skilled with sling and spear, fearless in the hunt. Yet they always seemed to move with a shared purpose, as if some unspoken destiny bound them together. As young men, Romulus and Remus learned of their royal birth and the treachery that had condemned them. They returned to overthrow the usurper who had taken their grandfather's throne, restoring him to power. But they were not content to rule over an old kingdom. They wanted a new city, one that would rise from the ground they had roamed as children. The brothers agreed on the Valley of the Seven Hills as their home, but quarreled over which hill should be the city's heart. Romulus favored the Palatine, Remus preferred the Aventine. They turned to the gods for a sign, watching the skies for omens of birds. Remus claimed to have seen 6 vultures first. Romulus swore he had seen 12. Tempers flared. The quarrel turned bitter, and in a moment of rage, Romulus struck Remus down. Some say Remus mocked the low height of Romulus's new walls and leapt over them in jest, prompting the fatal blow. Others claim it was a duel, born of pride. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Remus lay dead, and Romulus stood alone. Romulus named the new city Roma after himself. He built walls around the Palatine, called people from near and far to join him, and became the first king. Yet each year, the death of Remus was remembered in solemn rites, a reminder that even the greatest beginnings can be shadowed by loss. Thus, the city was born out of divine favor, brotherhood, ambition, and blood. With Remus gone and the Palatine chosen as the heart of the new city, Romulus set about a task that would define Rome's first identity, building its walls. In an age when hills and rivers marked boundaries, the act of raising a wall was more than protection. It was a declaration of existence, a claim to permanence in a land where most settlements still moved with the seasons. The Palatine's slopes offered a natural defense, but Romulus knew nature alone would not keep danger at bay. Raiders from beyond the Tiber, wild beasts from the forests, and even rival hill tribes could threaten the fledgling city. A wall would turn the Palatine from a hill into a fortress. The work began with clearing brush and marking the line of the wall with stakes. The chosen path followed the natural curve of the hill, tracing a circuit that would enclose the huts and gathering spaces. Men and women alike carried stones from the hillside and riverbank, stacking them into low foundations. Over these, wooden palisades were raised, tall stakes sharpened to points, bound together with rope and reinforced with clay at the base. It was not a wall of marble or cut stone, but it was strong enough to stop an enemy's charge. Along the inside, platforms were built so defenders could stand above, ready with slings, javelins, and bows. Gates were fashioned from heavy timber, barred with crossbeams that could be dropped in moments of danger. Building the wall was also a ritual. At dawn, Romulus would walk the circuit, offering prayers and grain to the gods at each corner. The people believed that a sacred boundary was being drawn, one that even the gods themselves would recognize. This pomerium, the holy perimeter, would remain at the core of Rome's laws for centuries to come. The wall was completed in weeks, but its impact was immediate. Traders felt safer entering the city. Shepherds brought their flocks within at night. Children played under its shadow. And yet, the wall also carried the weight of its own legend. The place where Remus had leapt in mockery, the act that had led to his death. Over time, the wall would be rebuilt in stone, expanded and extended to embrace all 7 hills. But in this first age, it was more than defense. It was a line between chaos and order, between the wandering life of the past and the rooted promise of the future. Behind it, Rome began to take its first breath as a city, a fris pag cititiu, long before Rome's skyline bristled with marble columns. Worship took root beneath open skies and in the quiet of ancient trees. First, in the early days of the Seven Hills, in the fora, the people built no grand temples of stone. Their sacred places were groves, springs, and clearings where the gods were believed to walk unseen. Each hill had its own holy sites. On the Palatine, a shaded grove near the Lupercal cave was dedicated to the guardians of the city's founding. The Aventine, wild and pine-covered, held altars to the huntress goddess, whose bow never missed. The Capitoline's summit, battered by wind and lightning, was the chosen place to honor the storm-bringer. Even the smallest hill, the Viminal, had a willow-ringed spring where travelers left offerings for safe passage. Worship in these places was simple, but steeped in meaning. Priests and priestesses, chosen from respected families, tended the groves by clearing dead branches, sweeping the altars, and guarding the sacred boundaries. They brought offerings of grain, milk, wine, and occasionally animals, always preceded by prayers spoken in measured, rhythmic tones meant to please the gods' ears. Over time, the people began to mark these sites with more than stones. Wooden shrines appeared, sheltering statues carved from oak or cypress. Each figure was adorned with garlands, bronze ornaments, and sometimes painted with mineral pigments to give life to its eyes and robes. Festivals were the lifeblood of the sacred calendar. At dawn, worshippers would gather, their paths lit by torches. If the hour was dark, musicians played flutes and drums, dancers circled the altars, and incense filled the air with sharp, resinous scents. These gatherings were more than acts of devotion. They were moments when the scattered hills came together in shared celebration, strengthening the bonds between them. The first true temples began as modest structures, timber frames, with clay walls and thatched roofs. Inside, sacred fires were kept burning day and night, tended by appointed keepers. The flames symbolized the life of the community, a constant reminder that the gods' protection could not be taken for granted. To disturb a sacred grove or defile a shrine was the gravest of offenses, punishable not just by law, but by the fear of divine wrath. Stories told of those who ignored such boundaries only to meet with sudden misfortune, a warning that the gods saw all in silence. In the centuries to follow, Rome's temples would grow vast and awe-inspiring, their columns reaching for the sky. But in this early age, it was the whisper of leaves in the grove, the gleam of dawn on a wooden idol, tew, and the murmur of prayers beneath an open sky that bound the people to the divine. Life on the Seven Hills was marked not only by seasons of work and war, but by the bright rhythm effect. These celebrations were more than diversions. They were the moments when the scattered tribes became one. When gods and mortals shared the same space in song, dance, and ritual. The festivals followed the turning of the year. In spring came the Floralia, a riot of flowers and garlands honoring the goddess of growth. Women wove crowns from wild blooms, children raced through meadows, scattering petals, and shepherds decorated their flocks with bright ribbons. It was a time to bless the fields and pastures for the months ahead. In summer, the solstitium marked the longest day. Fires were lit on hilltops, their flames leaping into the warm night air. Dancers whirled around the blazes, their shadows stretching into the darkness, while musicians played deep drums and high, lilting flutes. Young men and women leapt the fires for luck, and couples pledged vows beneath the stars. Autumn brought the Vinalia, the festival of the harvest, and the first tasting of the year's wine. Wooden cups were passed from hand to hand, and the air was thick with the scent of grapes roasted meat, and fresh bread. Storytellers recounted old battles and the blessings of the gods, while traders bartered for the season's bounty. Winter's darkness was broken by the Saturnalia, a feast of reversal and laughter. Roles were swapped, servants feasted at their masters' tables, children playfully commanded their elders, and gifts of candles and clay figurines were exchanged. The streets and paths between the hills rang with music, friendly mischief, and the crackle of roasting chestnuts. These festivals were not mere entertainment, they were vital threads of unity. Rivalries were set aside, disputes forgotten, and for a few days each season, the people remembered they were bound by more than walls and treaties. They were bound by shared joy. Sacred rites underpinned every celebration. Priests offered grain, wine, and incense to the gods at the opening of each festival, calling for their favor in the months to come. Omens were read, and no feast began until the signs were deemed favorable. For the youngest, the festivals were pure magic, a swirl of color, music, and taste. For the elders, they were a living memory, proof that the traditions of their ancestors still beat in the heart of their people. And for all, they were a promise that no matter the hardships of the year, there would always be days when the hills would dance together. In the earliest days, after Romulus raised the first walls, Rome was a kingdom, its fate guided by a line of rulers, whose names would echo through legend. These kings were not emperors in marble halls, but leaders close to the land, warriors, lawgivers, and builders whose reigns shaped the young city's foundations. The reign of Romulus, the founder, was one of bold expansion. He opened the city to all, wanderers, fugitives, and adventurers, swelling its population and strength. Under his rule, Rome fought its first battles with neighboring tribes, sealing alliances and marriages to ensure survival. His end was as mysterious as his birth. Some said he was struck down by the Senate, others that he vanished in a storm, taken to the gods. After Romulus came Numa Pompilius, a man of peace from the Sabine people. Numa was said to be divinely wise, taught by a nymph in sacred groves. He established Rome's religious rites, its priesthoods, and its sacred calendar, giving the city the order it needed after Romulus's restless conquests. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, was the opposite of Numa, fierce, ambitious, and eager for war. Under him, Rome destroyed its rival Alba Longa, bringing its people and their traditions into the growing city. Tullus built the first Senate house and expanded Rome's military reputation. Caelian, though legend claimed he angered the gods with neglect of religious rites and was struck down by lightning. Ancus Marcius, the fourth king, blended war and peace. He strengthened the city's walls, founded its port at Ostia, and built bridges over the Tiber. His reign brought Rome greater wealth and the ability to trade beyond its immediate neighbors. The next rulers, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus, deepened Rome's ties with the Etruscans. They oversaw great building projects, stone temples, sewers to drain the marshes, and public spaces that would one day become the Forum. Servius is credited with organizing the city into districts, giving structure to its governance. But Tarquinius Superbus, the Proud, ruled as a tyrant, sparking rebellion and ending the age of kings. In later years, historians and storytellers would argue over how much of these tales was truth and how much was legend. But for the people of early Rome, the kings were more than historical figures. They were the embodiment of the city's virtues and flaws, the courage of Romulus, the wisdom of Numa, the strength of Tullus, the balance of Ancus, the ambition of the Tarquins. And when the monarchy fell, their legacy both noble and cruel, would guide Rome into its next chapter. The birth of the Republic. In the early years, the land between the Palatine and Capitoline hills was a marshy hollow, a place where rainwater pooled, reeds swayed in the wind, and herds grazed on soft, wet ground. Few would have guessed that this low, muddy space would become the beating heart of Rome. The transformation began under the early kings, who saw in the hollow a meeting point for all the hills. Here, paths from every direction converged, bringing shepherds from the Palatine, traders from the Viminal, warriors from the Caelian, and priests from the Capitoline. But before it could serve as the city's central place, it had to be tamed. Great ditches were dug to drain the water, and the marshes were filled with earth and rubble. The most ambitious project was the Cloaca Maxima, a massive stone sewer built under Tarquinius Priscus and expanded by Tarquinius Superbus that carried runoff into the Tiber. With dry ground at last, the space could be paved and shaped for gatherings. The forum began as a marketplace. Merchants laid out their goods, baskets of grain, skins, wine jars, and bronze tools, while buyers moved from stall to stall, bargaining and gossiping. But it quickly became more than a place for trade. Kings and elders used the forum as a political stage. Here they addressed the citizens, announced new laws, and called the people to arms. Priests held public rituals, sacrificing animals to ensure the gods' favor for the city. Celebrations and victory parades passed through the space, the sound of music and cheering echoing against the hills. As the years passed, permanent structures began to rise around the edges: open-air stalls, wooden stages for orators, and small shrines to the gods of commerce and justice. The forum became the city's memory, the place where great events were witnessed, where alliances were made, and where disputes were settled before the eyes of the people. But it was also a space for the ordinary pulse of life. Children chased each other between stalls. Dogs slept in the shade of carts, and the smell of baking bread drifted from temporary ovens. The forum was where the city's many voices met, from the loud cries of merchants to the quiet prayers whispered at altars. By the end of the regal period, the forum had become the center of Rome's identity, not just physically, but spiritually and socially. In the centuries to come, marble temples, basilicas, and triumphal arches would crown it in grandeur. Yet in this early age, it was still simple, a dry, open place where the 7 hills came together to speak, trade, and remember they were one people in the shadow of the 7 hills. Life was never free from the threat of conflict. The early city of Rome was surrounded by other tribes: Latins, Sabines, Etruscans, and the boundaries between friendship, rivalry, and war could shift as quickly as the seasons. Warfare in these first centuries was not the grand spectacle of later Roman legions. It was personal, close and fierce, skirmishes fought with spear and shield, ambushes in forests, and raids at dawn. The aim was often not total conquest, but the capture of livestock, the control of a water source, or the defense of sacred land. Warriors trained from youth. On the Quirinal and Caelian, they drilled with wooden weapons, learning to strike, block, and move in formation. Shields were made of wicker or wood, covered in leather, and painted with tribal emblems. Spears were the primary weapon, but short blades and slings were common, and bows were used for hunting as much as for battle. Before any campaign, omens were sought. Priests examined the entrails of sacrificed animals, watched the flights of birds, or listened for thunder to judge the gods' favor. No leader dared march without signs that the divine forces stood with them. Battles were brutal, but often brief. Warriors clashed in open fields or along narrow passes, their shouts mingling with the clash of wood and bronze. The strongest fighters sought out their rivals, dueling in full view of both sides. Victory was marked by the taking of arms and armor from the fallen, to be displayed in the warrior's home or offered to the gods. War was also about a hill known for its courage in battle, gained respect among allies and fear among enemies. This pride could unite the city, but it could also spark rivalry between its own warriors, each eager to prove themselves the bravest. Even in peacetime, the threat of attack kept weapons close at hand. Patrols walked the city's boundaries, watchfires burned on the ridges, and every household kept at least one spear within reach. The walls of the Palatine offered protection, but the surrounding hills acted as the city's first shield, their warriors quick to respond to any alarm. In later centuries, Rome would perfect the art of war, building disciplined legions and conquering vast territories. But in this early age, warfare was raw and immediate, a test of courage, skill, and the will to protect what was theirs. In the early days of the Seven Hills, Rome was not yet the unchallenged power of the Tiber Valley. It was one settlement among many, surrounded by Latin villages, Sabine hill forts, and Etruscan cities. Survival depended as much on diplomacy as on the spear. Alliances were forged in many ways. Marriage was one of the most common. A daughter of one tribe wed to the son of another, binding the families in peace. These unions were celebrated with feasts, music, and vows before the gods, and were as much political agreements as personal bonds. Trade was another bridge. A well-timed gift of grain during a famine, or the sharing of iron spearheads in return for salt, would turn rivals into friends. Such exchanges were often sealed in ritual, a shared drink of wine, a clasp of hands before an altar, or the swearing of oaths on sacred ground. But peace was rarely permanent. Old grievances, raids over grazing land, or insults to a leader's honor could reignite conflict. Rivalries were nurtured as carefully as alliances, sometimes lasting generations. The people kept these memories alive in their stories. Tales of treachery, victories, and betrayals repeated at winter fires. The Sabines were both frequent enemies and valued allies. Their warriors were fierce, but their lands offered rich pastures and skilled craftsmen. Relations with the Etruscans to the north were equally complex. Their wealth and advanced building methods were tempting to emulate, but their dominance in the region was a constant threat. Within the Seven Hills themselves, tensions sometimes flared. A dispute over water rights between the Viminal and Esquiline, or hunting grounds claimed by both the Aventine and Caelian, could lead to skirmishes that had to be settled in the forum by the city's leaders. Festivals often served as neutral ground for repairing strained ties. The sharing of food, song, and dance was a reminder that all depended on the same gods for harvests and protection. Priests and elders acted as mediators, using both persuasion and ritual to bring enemies back into the fold. In this way, Rome learned an early lesson to survive. It had to balance the sword with the open hand. Every alliance was a shield against one danger, but also a potential chain to another. Every rivalry carried risk, but also the chance to prove strength and win respect. These shifting bonds were the heartbeat of early Roman politics, a dance of trust and suspicion, unity and division, that would shape the city's path for centuries to come. In the early days of the Seven Hills, women's lives were woven into every strand of the city's survival. While men often took the forefront in war, politics, and public ceremony, the work and influence of women reached deep into the fabric of daily life, shaping Rome in ways that would echo for generations. Women managed the heart of the household, not just in cooking and child rearing, but in overseeing storage of grain, preparation of wool, and tending to the home's sacred hearth. The fire that burned in each home was a symbol of the family's life, and its care was a matter of honor. Kais. In the fields, women worked alongside men during planting and harvest. On market days, they carried baskets of produce, milk, and cheese to the forum, bartering for tools, cloth, or salt. Skilled craftswomen spun wool into fine thread, wove baskets from willow, and shaped clay pots for storage and trade. Many women also served as keepers of tradition and faith. Some were priestesses, tending sacred fires, interpreting omens, or guarding shrines in the sacred groves. Their role in ritual life was vital. Without their prayers and offerings, the community believed the gods' favor could falter. Women influenced diplomacy as well. Marriages were often political tools, joining families from different hills or tribes. A bride might bring not only a dowry of goods, but also connections and trust that could ease tensions or secure alliances. The legends of early Rome also speak of women, whose courage changed the city's fate. Tales of the Sabine women tell of those who, after being taken to Rome, stepped between their Roman husbands and their Sabine kin in battle, begging for peace. Please stop the fighting, forging unity between the two peoples, a reminder that women could be peacemakers where men could not. Life was not without hardship. Childbirth was dangerous, and survival in the rugged hills demanded constant labor. Yet women's work was valued, and their wisdom was sought in matters of home, faith, and sometimes even counsel. In the centuries to come, Roman law and custom would shape women's rights and freedoms in complex ways, but in this early age, before written codes, their place in society was defined by necessity and respect for the roles they fulfilled. They were not only wives, mothers, and daughters. They were farmers, traders, artisans, healers, and keepers of the sacred flame that warmed the heart of Rome. In the early days of the Seven Hills, there were no scrolls of written law, no carved tablets for all to see. Justice was carried not in ink and stone, but in the memory of elders, the customs of tribes, and the will of the gods. Disputes were settled in the open air, in the forum's packed earth, beneath a sacred grove's branches, or at the boundary stones between hills. The parties involved would speak their claims before an assembly of elders, warriors, artis, and sometimes priests who acted as both judges and keepers of tradition. Paik. The rules they followed were not invented in the moment. They were mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, ancient customs passed down through countless seasons. These unwritten laws covered matters of property, marriage, trade, and punishment. A man who stole another's goat might owe repayment in livestock and labor. A broken marriage agreement could demand the return of dowry goods. Injuries might be compensated with food or tools rather than bloodshed. The gods were considered the ultimate witnesses. Oaths were sworn over altars or before sacred fires, with the belief that false words would invite divine wrath. In serious disputes, omens might be sought, a bird's flight, a sudden wind, to reveal the gods' judgment. Enforcement rested on the community, or a police force. The power to uphold justice lay in the willingness of neighbors and kin to pressure wrongdoers into honoring decisions. Shame was a powerful tool. To be known as one who broke oaths or defied judgment could mean exile from the safety of the hills. In cases involving multiple tribes or hills, mediators were chosen from respected families with ties to both sides. These go-betweens often relied on diplomacy as much as custom, seeking solutions that would preserve peace without undermining honor. Punishments could be harsh, but they were meant to restore balance rather than simply inflict pain. A murderer might be exiled rather than executed, forcing him to live beyond the walls without the protection of the city. Those who violated sacred boundaries might be required to offer costly sacrifices or public acts of penance. In time, these oral laws would form the foundation for Rome's written codes. But in this early age, the people trusted memory, tradition, and the watchful eyes of their community to keep order. The belief was simple: a city could stand only if its word was kept, and the honor of its people was guarded as fiercely as its walls. In the early days of the Seven Hills, before marble temples and gilded altars, the link between the people and the gods was kept alive by fire. To let the sacred flames die was to invite darkness, misfortune, and the anger of the divine. Every household kept a hearth, but the city itself had its own sacred fire, a flame that represented the life and spirit of all the hills combined. This fire was tended by chosen keepers, often women from respected families, who guarded it day and night. It burned in a sheltered shrine on the Palatine, fed with seasoned wood and protected from rain and wind. The priests of early Rome were not rulers, but they held immense influence. Known for their knowledge of omens, rituals, and the cycles of the seasons, they advised kings, settled disputes, and presided over public ceremonies. The people believed that without their blessings, no harvest would prosper, no wall would stand, and no war would end in victory. Religious duties followed a strict rhythm. At dawn, the firekeepers offered grain and wine to the flames. At midday, they recited prayers to honor the household gods and the greater deities. At night, they banked the fire with embers to ensure it survived until morning. On certain feast days, torches lit from the sacred fire were carried through the streets, spreading its protection. The priests also guarded sacred knowledge, the interpretation of omens, the correct words for each prayer, the gestures that pleased or offended the gods. Some were specialists: augurs, who read the flight of birds, haruspices, who studied the entrails of sacrificed animals, and flamens dedicated to maintaining the gods' favor was not just a matter of devotion. It was a matter of survival. A failed ritual, a neglected offering, or a defiled altar could be blamed for poor harvests, floods, or military defeat. The priests bore this responsibility heavily, knowing the city's fate could be tied to their precision in sacred duties. In later centuries, Rome's religion would grow more complex, its temples towering and its rituals codified in law. But in this early age, faith was woven into the rhythm of daily life, its heart beating in the steady glow of the sacred fire, a light that never rested, as the gods it honored. The end of the kingship in Rome was not sudden, but the result of years of growing tension. The Seven Hills had seen rulers both wise and tyrannical, but the last, Tarquinius Superbus, the proud, pushed the city beyond its patience. His harsh rule, heavy taxes, and disregard for tradition turned allies into enemies, and citizens into conspirators. The breaking point came not on the battlefield, but in the forum. A scandal involving his family and the dishonor of a noblewoman, Lucretia, ignited outrage across the hills. Her death became a rallying cry for justice and for the end of monarchy. The call was simple: no single man should hold the fate of Rome in his hands. The leaders of the revolt, among them Lucius Junius Brutus, moved quickly. The city gates were closed to the king. His supporters were exiled or stripped of power, and the people swore an oath never again to be ruled by a king. In his place, they established a new system: magistrates elected to serve for a single year, their power limited by the will of the people and the council of the Senate. The This was the birth of the Republic, though in its earliest form it was still a fragile experiment. The Senate, composed of Rome's leading families, took a central role in decision-making. Assemblies of citizens were called to approve laws and elect magistrates, giving the people a voice they had never held before. Old customs remained. Omens were still read before battles, and religious rites still opened political meetings. But the shift was profound. Authority was no longer inherited by blood. It had to be earned and renewed. Disputes between the hills were now handled in council rather than with arms, though the threat of force was never far away. The early republic was not perfect. Power still rested in the hands of the wealthy, and the voices of the poor were limited. Yet it marked a turning point, the idea that Rome belonged to its people, not to a single ruler. These seeds would grow into a system that, for centuries, would guide Rome through war, expansion, and political strife. But in these first uncertain years, the Republic was like a young tree, its roots barely sunk, its branches reaching toward a future, still hidden in shadow. For generations, the Seven Hills had been neighbors, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals, each with its own leaders, traditions, and loyalties. But with the fall of the monarchy and the birth of the Republic, the time came for them to bind themselves together under a single civic identity. It did not happen overnight. The Palatine still saw itself as the heart of the city. The Aventine kept its spirit of independence. The Capitoline guarded its sacred height. The Quirinal held to its martial pride. The Viminal continued as a hub of trade. The Esquiline watched the frontier, and the Caelian maintained its warrior brotherhood. Each hill had its own voice, and none wished to lose it. The first step toward unity was practical. Shared defense. Walls were extended to enclose all 7 hills, turning them into one fortified city. The construction was a feat of labor and cooperation, with workers from every hill lifting stone, shaping timber, and guarding the work crews. Watchtowers rose where ridges met, manned by soldiers from mixed companies rather than single hill units. Next came shared governance. Representatives from each hill met in the Senate, bringing their concerns to a central council. Though debates could be fierce and often loud, decisions were now made for the good of the whole rather than one hill at the expense of another. Festivals and public rites were held in the forum to strengthen the sense of common identity. Unity was tested quickly. Raids from neighboring tribes threatened the city's outer fields, and disputes over water. Rights fled again. But now, instead of acting alone, the hills responded together. Combined forces drove off the attackers, and shared resources were used to repair and expand the aqueducts. In time, the people began to speak not of the hills as separate places, but of the city as one. Children born in this era grew up thinking of themselves as Romans first, and members of a particular hill second. Still, the unique character of each hill was preserved in its customs, crafts, and patron deities, a patchwork that made the city rich in diversity while bound in purpose. This unity would become Rome's greatest strength. The cooperation forged in these years gave the Republic the resilience to face greater threats beyond the Tiber and to dream not only of survival, but of expansion. For the first time, the 7 hills stood as one, and the world beyond began to take notice. The strength of early Rome did not rest solely in its walls, armies, or leaders. It lived in the spirit of its people. Across the 7 hills, this spirit was a blend of endurance, pride, and a fierce devotion to community, shaped by the daily struggles and triumphs of ordinary life. The people of Rome were not a single tribe, but a mosaic. Latins, Sabines, and Etruscans mingled in its streets, joined by traders from far-off lands and wanderers seeking a new start. This diversity was not always without tension, but it brought with it new skills, ideas, and traditions that made the city stronger. Hardship was a constant teacher. The people endured harsh winters, summer droughts, raids from hostile neighbors, and the ever-present threat of illness. Yet each challenge was met with stubborn resilience. If a wall was torn down by storm, it was rebuilt higher. If a field failed, the people shared grain from their storehouses. If enemies burned a village, the survivors were welcomed within the city's walls. Pride in the city ran deep. Families told their children of Romulus and Remus, of the sacred fire that had never gone out, of the unity forged when the hills joined together. These stories were not just entertainment. They were reminders that every citizen had a role to play in Rome's survival. The markets and festivals kept bonds strong. In the forum, merchants greeted customers by name, and news spread faster than the river's current. In the sacred groves, prayers were said not only for individual families, but for the health of the whole city. When a child was born, neighbors brought gifts. When a warrior fell in battle, the entire community mourned. Even disagreements carried the mark of Roman spirit. Arguments in the Senate or at the market could be loud and passionate, but the people valued resolution. They knew that the city's safety depended on unity when it mattered most. The Roman people valued adaptability, the willingness to learn from others and improve upon what was learned. From the Etruscans they borrowed engineering, from the Sabines farming techniques, from traders new goods and crafts. Yet every borrowed idea was reshaped until it became distinctly Roman. In later centuries, poets and historians would speak of the virtus, the Roman virtue, as the combination of courage, discipline, loyalty, and honor. But in this early age, it was simply the way of life, to work hard, keep faith with the gods and each other, and to leave the city stronger than it was before. This spirit would carry Rome through centuries of change, conquest, and conflict. It was the unseen foundation on which every stone of the city rested. Time softens the edges of events, turning them into stories. In early Rome, the great deeds and struggles of the past, some true, some half-true, and some born entirely from imagination, began to weave into a shared memory. These myths, passed from voice to voice, became the threads that bound the 7 hills together. Around evening fires, elders spoke of Romulus, not as a man who ruled, but as a figure touched by the gods, vanishing into a storm to join them. The she-wolf of the Palatine was no longer just a wild creature. She was a divine guardian, her image carved into wood, etched on pottery, and painted on shields. The story of the Sabine women was told as a lesson in courage and unity, their plea for peace becoming a model for resolving conflict. The arrival of Aeneas from far-off Troy was celebrated as the beginning of Rome's destiny, a link to a heroic past beyond Italy's shores. These tales were not fixed. Each telling shaped them anew, adding flourishes, changing details to suit the listener, or tying the story to the teller's own hill. The Aventine might claim that Romulus once hunted in its forests. The Capitoline might swear that the gods first revealed the city's fate from its rocky heights. The memory was kept not just in words, but in ritual. Festivals reenacted legendary moments, wolf-masked dancers for the Lupercal, mock battles for the founding, processions honoring Aeneas's arrival. These performances were as much about preserving identity as they were about entertaining the crowd. The line between history and legend was blurred. Few could say with certainty which events had truly happened as told. But that did not lessen their power. Myths gave meaning to the walls, the groves, the forum, and the river. They explained why the city existed and why it must endure. The young grew up steeped in these stories, learning pride in the city's past, alongside practical skills. To know the myths was to know who you were and who you might become. In later centuries, Rome's historians would try to set these tales in order, writing them down as if they were fixed truths. But here, in the early days, they were living things, growing and shifting with each telling, alive in the breath of the people. In this way, myth became memory, and memory became identity. And so the people of the Seven Hills carried their past into the future, not in stone inscriptions, but in the stories they could never forget. In the early days of the Seven Hills, few could have imagined that this cluster of wooden huts, market stalls, and sacred groves would one day be the heart of an empire. Yet even then, the qualities that would shape Rome's destiny were taking root: discipline, resilience, ambition, and the will to endure. The city's position along the Tiber gave it access to trade routes, reaching deep into the Italian peninsula and out to the sea. Its hills provided natural defense, while its people's skill in war made them formidable against rivals. But perhaps most important was the way Rome absorbed and adapted to the cultures around it. Learning from Etruscans, Sabines, and distant traders, reshaping their ideas into something uniquely Roman. Leaders and elders spoke of a future where Rome would not merely survive, but led. They saw that the city's unity gave it strength, and its openness to outsiders gave it numbers and fresh ideas. They believed the Seven Hills were a foundation strong enough to bear the weight of greatness. Already the Forum was more than a market. It was a stage for speeches that inspired loyalty and stirred ambition. The walls enclosed not just huts and streets, but the seed of a political system that gave the people a voice. Early years, however, the watchtowers and warriors who guarded the city were not simply protecting homes, they were defending the future. There was a sense, felt in the hum of the markets, in the clang of the smith's hammer, in the solemn steps of priests carrying the sacred fire, that Rome was destined for something larger. Every festival, every law, every battle was a stone laid in the foundation of a city, whose name would one day echo across mountains, seas, and deserts. In time, Rome would stretch its influence far beyond the Tiber Valley, drawing nations into its orbit. Roads would bind its territories together, legions would march under its banners, and marble monuments would proclaim its power. But those glories would rest on the quiet labors and fierce determination of the people in this age. The farmers, shepherds, traders, warriors, and priests who believed their city was worth defending at all costs. The Rome of the early Republic was not yet the master of the world, but the heartbeat of empire was already there, pulsing in the Seven Hills, waiting for the day when the rest of the world would feel its reach. The story of Rome begins not with marble palaces or conquering legions, but with 7 hills, humble rises of earth along the Tiber, crowned with wooden huts, guarded by watchfires, and bound together by the will of their people. In the centuries to come, those hills would be covered in stone, their slopes carved into streets and plazas, their heights crowned with temples. Yet beneath all the grandeur, the land that birthed the city would remain the same. Each hill gave something to the whole. The Palatine offered leadership and vision, the Aventine, independence and spirit, the Capitoline, divine protection and defense, the Quirinal, martial discipline, the Viminal, trade and connection, the Esquiline, openness to the frontier, the Caelian, warrior strength. Together, they formed the city's character, a blend of caution and ambition, tradition and adaptability. Even as Rome grew into an empire, the memory of the 7 hills endured. Festivals still honored their ancient gods, still climbed their slopes. Children still heard the stories of the she-wolf, the Sabine women, and the first kings. The names of the hills became more than geography. They were symbols of unity. They were symbols, por, per pels per pyre, resilience, and the origins of Roman greatness. The hills also became a touchstone in times of crisis. When the city faced threats from without or discord within, leaders invoked the memory of the days when the 7 hills stood together against hunger, flood, and war. The old alliances between the hills were remembered as proof that unity was Rome's truest weapon. Over the centuries, much would change. Roads and aqueducts would stitch the city into the wider world. The Forum would grow into a forest of columns and statues. Sicily, the armies of Rome, would carry its banners to the edges of the known earth. Yet the 7 hills remained, silent witnesses to it all, their slopes holding the bones of shepherds, warriors, traders, and builders who had laid the city's first stones. To walk the hills in later ages was to step across layers of history, to stand on the Palatine and imagine Romulus marking the first walls, to climb the Capitoline and feel the storms of the old gods, to walk the Aventine Esquiline paths and recall the hunters who chose freedom over rule. The 7 hills were not merely the ground beneath Rome. They were the city's first heartbeat, and they beat still. And as long as the hills stand, so too will the memory of the people who turned a cluster of ridges beside a river into the city that would rule the world. Thank you, dear friends, for joining me on this journey through time, walking the ancient paths of the 7 hills and witnessing the birth of a city that would one day rule the world. From the humble huts of shepherds to the sacred fires, tended in silence, from the echoes of myth to the first walls of Rome, we have seen how history and legend intertwine to shape identity. The Rome of these early days was not the empire we know from books and monuments, but a living community of hope, struggle, and resilience. It was built by farmers, hunters, traders, warriors, and dreamers, people whose names may be forgotten, but whose spirit lives on in every stone and story that survives. The 7 hills still stand today, silent witnesses to centuries of triumph and turmoil. They remind us that greatness often begins in the simplest of places, and that unity, courage, and belief can turn even the smallest settlement into something eternal. I hope these stories inspire you to look at history not as a distant past, but as a living thread connecting us all. Until our next journey, may the fire of the past light your way forward